My name is Emily. I'm 34 years old and I work as a nurse. Last month I attended my stepsister's wedding reception. I wore a simple dress and kept mostly to myself. But during the reception my stepsister suddenly stood up, pointed at me and laughed. "This is my stepsister," she told the groom's family. "She's just a useless nurse." A few people around the table chuckled. I didn't argue or defend myself. I simply smiled. But then the groom's father began staring at me very carefully, as if my face triggered a distant memory. After a few seconds he leaned forward and slowly said, "Wait, aren't you the nurse who—" He stopped mid-sentence. In that instant the entire table fell silent. Before explaining what really happened next, let me start from the beginning. The reception hall was already buzzing when I arrived. Music drifted through the air, glasses clinked together, and laughter echoed around large, beautifully decorated tables. My stepsister Lily had always loved being the center of attention, and that night she had all of it. The venue looked stunning. Warm golden lights hung from the ceiling, and white flowers covered every table. In the middle of it all stood Lily in her bright white dress, smiling as if the whole world belonged to her. I paused near the entrance holding a small gift box in my hands. My dress was simple. Nothing flashy or expensive, just comfortable. Honestly, I didn't expect anyone to notice me. That had always been the dynamic between Lily and me. We grew up in the same house but our lives couldn't have been more different. After my father passed away, my mother married Lily's father. From the outside we became one family. Inside the house though things were never that simple. Lily had everything growing up. Private schools, luxury vacations, designer clothes. Meanwhile, I worked part-time jobs through college and eventually became a nurse. I never complained. I love what I do, helping people and caring for strangers during some of the hardest moments of their lives. It gives my life real meaning. But Lily always saw things differently. To her, success meant wealth, status, and appearances. And her wedding reflected exactly that. Waiters moved gracefully through the room carrying trays of champagne. A small band played soft music near the dance floor. Everywhere I looked, guests wore expensive suits and sparkling jewelry. I quietly walked toward the reception tables. A few relatives waved politely when they noticed me. Others barely looked up from their conversations. I didn't mind. I found an empty seat at the end of one of the long tables and sat down. From there I could see Lily moving through the crowd. She looked happy, truly happy. Her groom, Mark, stayed beside her, introducing her to different guests. From what little I knew, Mark seemed like a decent man, calm, polite, and very different from Lily's usual personality. About 20 minutes later, dinner service began. Guests slowly returned to their seats as plates were set on the tables. Soon the room filled with the soft clatter of forks and quiet conversation. Then Lily suddenly stood up. She tapped her glass with a spoon, and the clear ringing sound spread across the room. "Everyone," she called cheerfully. The conversations faded one by one. "I want to introduce someone to Mark's family." Then she turned and looked directly at me. I felt dozens of eyes follow her gaze and my stomach tightened. "Emily," Lily said loudly, waving her hand. "Come here for a second." I hadn't expected that. But refusing would only make things awkward, so I stood and walked toward the main table while the guests watched quietly. When I reached her, Lily placed a hand on my shoulder. Her smile looked warm, but I knew that smile. I had seen it many times growing up. It was the smile she wore right before making someone the punchline of a joke. She turned toward the groom's family seated nearby. "This," she said, gesturing toward me, "is my stepsister." Then she gave a light laugh. "And before anyone asks," she paused just long enough to capture everyone's attention, "she's just a nurse." A few people chuckled politely. Someone murmured, "Oh, that's nice." I felt the familiar sting of embarrassment rise in my chest, but I kept my expression calm. I simply smiled. Long ago I learned that arguing with Lily only made things worse. For a moment the dinner continued normally. Guests lifted their glasses again and someone quickly changed the subject. I assumed that would be the end of it. But then something unexpected happened. Across the table the groom's father suddenly stopped eating. He was an older man with silver hair and sharp, observant eyes. At first I thought he was just listening to the conversation. But then I realized something strange. He was staring directly at me. Not casually. Not politely. He was studying my face as if searching his memory for something important. Around us, the table remained lively. Glasses clinked, people chatted about the food, and someone nearby burst into laughter at a joke. But the groom's father seemed distant. Slowly, he set his fork down and leaned back in his chair, still thinking. Mark noticed immediately. "Dad, everything okay?" he asked. The older man nodded, though his attention seemed elsewhere. "Yes, I'm fine," he replied quietly. Then he glanced around the table, almost as if organizing his thoughts. Lily, of course, noticed none of it. She was busy describing her honeymoon plans. "We're going to Italy first," she said excitedly. "Rome, then the Amalfi Coast. I told Mark we deserve something unforgettable." Several guests smiled and offered more congratulations. A waiter arrived to serve the next course. Plates were replaced, glasses were refilled, and the band's music grew slightly louder as the evening continued. To everyone else, it looked like a perfectly normal wedding reception. But the groom's father still seemed deep in thought. After a moment, he leaned slightly toward Mark again. "Son," he said quietly, "what did she say her stepsister's name was?" Mark glanced in my direction. "Emily." The older man repeated the name slowly, testing it against a distant memory. Lily laughed softly. "Oh, don't worry about Emily," she said with a playful grin. "She spends most of her life inside hospitals." A few guests chuckled politely again. But the groom's father didn't react to the joke. Instead, he turned toward me. He looked at me again. This time not with suspicion or accusation, but with quiet curiosity. His expression was the same as someone searching through distant memories. After a moment, he spoke slowly. "I'm sorry," he said politely. "Have we met somewhere before?" The question caught me off guard. I shook my head slightly. "I'm not sure," I replied. "I meet a lot of people through my work." He nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense." For a moment, he looked down at the table as if trying to pull a memory into focus. It seemed like he was about to say something more, but then he stopped, as though the answer was still just beyond his reach. Across the table, Mark leaned closer to his father. "You really think you recognize her?" he asked quietly. The older man shrugged slightly. "I don't know," he admitted. "There's just something familiar." Lily waved her hand dismissively. "Oh please," she laughed. "Emily's not famous." A few guests smiled awkwardly, but this time the laughter sounded forced. The groom's father still looked deep in thought. He slowly rubbed his chin and glanced at me again, this time more gently, more thoughtfully. "Strange," he murmured. "I feel like I've seen you during a very important moment in my life." The table grew noticeably quieter. Even Lily paused for a moment. But before anyone could ask another question, the band suddenly launched into a louder song. Guests nearby clapped, and several people stood up and headed toward the dance floor. Gradually, the room's attention shifted away from our table. Lily immediately stood up. "Perfect," she said cheerfully. "Time for dancing." She grabbed Mark's hand and pulled him toward the dance floor. Other guests followed, and within minutes most of the room was filled with music, laughter, and people dancing. But the groom's father remained seated for a little while longer. He looked at the dance floor, then back at me, still thoughtful, still searching his memory. Finally, he stood up slowly and said something that made my curiosity grow even stronger. "I'm sure of one thing," he said quietly. "We definitely met somewhere important." Then he walked toward the dance floor to join the others. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't stop wondering what moment he was trying to remember. The music grew louder again. Guests laughed, danced, and raised their glasses in celebration. For a while, the strange moment at the table seemed to fade into the background. But I could still feel that something unfinished hung in the air. Even from across the room, I noticed the groom's father glancing in my direction a few times while people danced around him, almost like a memory was slowly returning. About 20 minutes later, the band stopped for a short break. Guests returned to their seats, catching their breath and reaching for water or drinks. The groom's father walked back to the table and sat down again. This time he looked different, more certain, like something in his mind had finally connected. He looked at me again, but now there was clear recognition in his eyes. He leaned forward slightly. "Emily," he said slowly. "Yes," I replied. For a second he didn't speak. Then he asked a question that made the entire table pause. "3 years ago, were you working at St. Mary's Hospital?" My heart skipped. "Yes," I answered carefully. The older man exhaled slowly, like the final piece of a puzzle had fallen into place. I knew it, he whispered. Mark looked confused. Knew what, Dad? The groom's father turned toward his son. His voice remained calm, but there was emotion behind it. 3 years ago, he said, I was in a terrible car accident. The table fell silent. I was rushed to the emergency room in critical condition, he continued. He paused briefly before going on. The roads were blocked that night because of a massive protest downtown. Most of the doctors couldn't reach the hospital. Several guests leaned closer, listening carefully now. For nearly 6 hours, he said slowly, there was only one nurse who refused to leave my side. For nearly 6 hours, he continued slowly, there was only one nurse who stayed with me. Then he gently pointed in my direction. That nurse was Emily. The table went completely silent. I suddenly felt dozens of eyes turn toward me. The groom's father kept speaking, his voice filled with gratitude. She monitored my breathing, checked my pulse, and kept talking to me so I wouldn't lose consciousness. Then he looked at Mark. If she had walked away even once, he said, I might not have survived until the doctors finally arrived. Mark stared at me in shock. You saved my dad? I shook my head slightly. I was just doing my job. But the older man firmly shook his head. No, he said. You did much more than that. Slowly he turned toward Lily. This time the warmth in his voice had disappeared. You introduced her as just a nurse, he said calmly. The entire room had fallen silent now. No one moved. No one spoke. You should never say just a nurse about someone who saves lives. Lily's face turned pale. For the first time that evening she had nothing to say. The groom's father then looked back at me. If it weren't for you, he said quietly, I wouldn't be sitting here today watching my son get married. Mark suddenly stood up from his chair and walked around the table toward me. When he reached me, he extended his hand. Thank you, he said sincerely. I truly mean that. Around the table, guests began whispering softly. A few people looked uncomfortable, probably remembering how they had laughed earlier. One older woman nearby even shook her head disapprovingly at Lily. I suddenly felt very uncomfortable being the center of attention. So I simply smiled politely. Like I said, I told them, I was just doing my job. But the groom's father spoke again. And you did it better than anyone could have. In the background, the band began playing music again. Gradually, the reception returned to its usual rhythm. Laughter, conversations, and dancing. But something had clearly changed. People looked at me differently now. Not as the quiet stepsister sitting in a simple dress, but as someone who had done something meaningful. Meanwhile, Lily stayed unusually quiet for the rest of the evening. The confidence she carried earlier had disappeared. And for the first time in many years she avoided looking directly at me. Sometimes the most powerful moments in life don't come from revenge. They come from the quiet truth finally being seen. And that night an entire room learned something important. Never underestimate someone because of their job. Especially when that job is saving lives. Red Heart.